Okay, and I started the recording also.
Yeah.
So, hey, everybody. I don't know, Manish, if there's anything you wanted to say before we get started.
Yeah. Just a moment that. Very good evening in India and very good morning at USA. Welcome all of you. Special thanks to today for LDavis, Assistant Director, Social Design Department, Maryland Institute College of Art, MICA, Baltimore, Maryland, USA. And he is the partner of this course also. As you already know, this is a 3-month part-time certificate course of Fundamental of Social Design in association with Department of Applied Arts, Faculty of Visual Arts, Banaras Hindu University, Maryland Institute College of Art, MICA, Baltimore, and Michigan State University, USA. Now with us, Professor LDavis, Assistant Director of the Social Design Department, Maryland Institute College of Art, MICA. Welcome, Lee, and welcome everyone. And now today is the session taken by Lee. I am requesting to Lee, please start the session as per their convenience. And there is no time bound, whatever the convenience is there. And requesting to student, if possible, please put the questions on the chat box. It is easy to understand and receive the information. Again, welcome, and yeah, Lee, please start.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Manish, and good evening, everyone. I really appreciate your joining us late in the evening there, and it's still morning, early morning here in Baltimore. So you can, I don't know if everyone can see my screen.
Just a moment, I just want to ask one thing. It's the recording start?
Yes, I started the recording, Manish, yes.
Oh, that's good. That's good. That's
good. So welcome everyone. I don't know if you all can hear me okay, and I think maybe you hear some nature sounds in the background from the forest, some birds chirping.
That's great.
And this is a session that's really near and dear to my own heart and interest that I have here in our center in Baltimore of life-centered design and biomimicry. And I just would like to today share a little bit about these concepts, and we'll practice a couple of activities together. So as Manish said, I'm LDavis. I co-direct the Center for Social Design here at MICA, the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore. Some of you may have joined some earlier sessions we had with some of our colleagues, and we're really honored to be collaborating together with all of you on this amazing new course on fundamentals of social design. So today we have about an hour together. This is some of the goals for today. I hope that we'll have a chance to introduce some of the principles of the concept of human-centered, of life-centered design, and contrasting that to the typical human-centered design approach that we take in social design. We'll talk a little bit more about the concept of biomimicry, what it is and also what it isn't. We'll look at the pieces and practice. And we also have 2 exercises planned just to give you a flavor of the biomimicry design process and how we apply it here in our center. So just as a starting point, if I could ask everyone to please mute your microphone, but as Manish said, please at any time put your questions into the chat. And if you have any questions as we go along, please, I encourage you to reach out. I'm very excited to engage with all of you today. So I'm going to pause our forest sounds for the moment. So the first thing that I'd like to do, because we have such a large group, we won't have an opportunity to go around. I would love to hear and learn more about you. But what I would like to ask each of you to do is we're going to be talking today a lot about drawing inspiration from nature. And so I'm putting into the chat for everyone a link. This is a link to our national aquarium here in Baltimore. And this is a website that they put together of all of the animals and species that they have inside of the aquarium. And what I'd like to ask each of you to do is just to take 5 minutes to go to this website. You can search and find thousands of different types of animals and species. I'd like you to just take a couple of minutes to look at the different species, perhaps find one that is most interesting to you. And then when you're ready, I'd like you to put into the chat the animal that you are inspired by. What inspired you about this animal? And if you find an animal that or a species that reflects some aspect of your personality or of your identity, I would ask you to put that into the chat. So I'll give you just 5 minutes. Please take a moment to explore this website and find an animal that inspires you.
This is really very good and very resourceful website.
Yeah, it's beautiful. The National Aquarium is quite a treasure. I don't know, Manish, if you were able to go when you were here in Baltimore. It's a beautiful place.
Yeah, I already visited 2-3 parks and zoo also on that time.
So just a few more minutes.
Yeah. I request to all participants, please mute their mic. Amazing photographs and amazing animals, birds, and lots of species also. That's really very wonderful and very beautiful. Yeah.
So as you find an animal that inspires you, just put into the chat the name of the animal and perhaps a few words about why it inspired you. Here, I'll show you mine. I found this, I've spent a lot of time in Brazil. Brazil is a place that I get a lot of inspiration, and I found in the website this blue-crowned motmot is a bird that I thought was so beautiful and vibrant. I also, as you can see, I have very tall, crazy hair, and I was inspired by the vibrant colors on the head of this bird. But I was also really interested that not only does it fly, but it also, unlike many birds, it burrows its nest into the ground. And so I also like the symbolism of this bird that is able to fly freely, but is also very grounded. And that related a lot to sort of my own sensibilities. So just take another minute and put into the chat what animal inspires you. I see the dolphin. I love the dolphins. Puffin, beautiful. Clownfish, that one sounds very interesting. Turtles, several dolphins. Dolphins, very intelligent, yes. Just a few more seconds. Great, thank you. Thank you for sharing. The puffin, yes, is looking very, very good. I love the Atlantic puffin. So I started with this exercise. I want to introduce first this concept of biophilia. I don't know if this is a term or a concept. It's really a philosophy, in effect, that is sort of the foundation of much of what we want to talk about today. E.O. Wilson wrote this seminal book in 1984 called Biophilia, and really, at least here in the United States, promoted this concept. And really the idea of biophilia is the sort of innate tendency that we as humans have to connect with the natural world. And really, it's very much about humanity and people being a part of a natural system, not separated from it and apart from it. Over time, especially I think in the Western culture, we see ourselves as people as somehow separate from the rest of the ecosystem and the natural world around us. But biophilia challenges that and says that we have an inclination as humans to be drawn to and a part of nature. And Wilson really, in his book, talks a lot about this concept of the biophilia hypothesis, this emotional connection that we have as humans to other living organisms. And he introduces this concept and terminology of sociobiology, really connecting people in our society to the natural ecosystem. And he talks too about the sort of moral aspect of biophilia, and that there is an ethic, a sort of philosophy and ethics there, and a responsibility that we have as humans to value and respect nature, to see ourselves as a part of it, to care for it as a part of our heritage, and sees that humanity is a part of and grew out of other organisms of this natural system, so that we are innately and historically connected to it. A colleague of his, Stephen Keller, also from Yale University, took this a step further in his writing, really talked about also the human need as society has divided itself more and more from nature, this sort of need that we have as humans, this earnestness to reconnect with nature around us, and identify these 9 hypothesized dimensions of biophilia. I won't talk about all of them, but really he looks at biophilia from a variety of different perspectives, from the moral and ethical aspects of it, aesthetic aspects, our natural appreciation of the beauty and visual elements of nature. And so I encourage you to explore more of this concept. I'm going to put now into the chat a link to an organization, Biophilic Cities, which is taking this concept of biophilia and trying to integrate it into how we design our cities, how we reimagine how to create cities that are more connected to the natural world and the natural ecosystems. So this concept of biophilia is really at the center and the foundation of the concept of life-centered design that I'd like to talk more about with all of you today. And really at its heart, the idea of life-centered design is about designing for all of life, not just human life. And I know we in the Center for Social Design and in many that are working in this field of social design, we tend to use the terminology of human-centered design, and looking really having a deeper understanding of people and our behaviors and people most affected by problems, putting them at the center of the process to design solutions to them. Life-centered design does not contradict that, but it builds upon that and asks us to think more broadly about our process and our worldview. This is a quote from Jane Surrey, who is a partner emeritus from the global design firm IDEO, who in the 1980s really started talking about this concept of life-centered design. And she said the future is life-centered. We have to think of ourselves not just as humans and of a human culture, but ourselves within a broader system, a broader ecosystem of other living things of which we are a part. And Fulton and her colleagues at IDEO in 2014 created this deck of cards, which I'll also put a link to in the chat. You can download these cards. The idea was really to inspire designers as they're working on any problem to draw inspiration from nature, to ground their process and their creative ideation in the natural world and looking to nature for inspiration. So I encourage you to look at the nature cards. You can download them in PDF, just a resource for exploring this concept in your practice. I know Manish sent to you a link to this article. If you didn't have a chance to read it already, I'm putting the link into the chat now. This is an article that came out in 2015 by a friend and colleague of mine, Prasad, who used to be at the Arizona State University. They had a Center for Biomimicry at ASU. And he's a product designer by training. And in this article, he really began a really important conversation and critique of human-centered design, challenging us as designers to really reconsider this sort of anthropocentric position we take in our work, to really imagine designing not only for people, but all inhabitants of our biosphere, for all creatures and animals and species of a broader ecosystem. Another really interesting article from 2019 by Jess Weaver, I'm putting this link into the chat as well, really used a metaphorical concept of bee-centered design to similarly challenge designers to think more broadly about designing for natural ecosystems. He used this term bee-centered design really to raise the point that, you know, in bees, as many of you have probably seen over the years, have become really endangered by the climate crisis, rising temperatures, use of pesticides, et cetera. They are, as he said, really sort of sentinel species. They're the most vulnerable, an example of some of the most vulnerable species. And so he asks and challenges us to consider the impacts of our decisions as designers, the collateral damage and impact of our actions on the larger systems around us, and keeping our eyes on the most vulnerable, using the bees as the metaphor for that, but really also thinking about in our process what other endangered species or what other people are most vulnerable, and how do we ensure that our design process is taking into consideration the most vulnerable around us. So this increasing discourse, these are just two articles. There are many others I'm happy to share as more and more designers begin to really challenge and question this overemphasis on a human-centered approach, really shifting from this, quote, ego approach to the more eco approach. And you can see here shifting from this sort of human-centered approach where humanity and people are put at the top and the center of the process, to seeing us and in a more cyclical way as a part of a broader ecosystem. And it's also about sort of shifting our mentality when we think about our process. So moving from sort of possibility to purpose in our approach to design. So typically in the human-centered design process, we look at imagining new possibilities, and we ask questions like, how might we, right? How might we imagine new products or new systems or new processes to address human problems. And we look at that typically more from the perspective of the benefits to human society and to people. But what these articles and others are challenging us to do is to think also about the implications and the impact of our work, and ask the fundamental questions of, should what we're designing even exist? Do we need another plastic product? Do we need another technology? And what are the implications of our design decisions on the wider ecosystem around us? So there are many different models of human-centered, of life-centered design that are evolving around us. If you just Google life-centered design, you'll see many, many different frameworks and models. The one I'm sharing here with you is one that are some students in a class that I'll tell you more about in a moment evolved around these 6 sort of general principles. So looking at our process and creating a set of guiding principles, even metrics that we can use to assess ourselves and our design process, looking at issues of diversity, looking at its alignment with nature, the principles of emergence, of reciprocity, of responsibility, and of adaptability. These really draw upon sort of general life principles in biology, which we'll explore a little bit more in just a moment. So I'd like to segue now from this broader concept of a life-centered design perspective into more specifically the concept of biomimicry. And biomimicry is a term and an idea that is not new, but it's been gaining a lot of momentum in the last 2 decades. And so the first thing I'd like to do is share just a brief video that was produced by our students last year.
When you hear the word biomimicry, what do you think of?
Can everyone see the video and hear? I just want to make sure that you all can hear that. Yep, okay.
Yes, we can hear it.
Leaders in the field.
Thank you.
Biomimicry is the method of looking to nature to solve human problems. From something as simple as a needle that painlessly penetrates skin like a mosquito, to something as complex as a city, modeling their project funding distribution after the spreading of mushroom spores. No matter what the scale of the problem, nature has over 4.5 billion years worth of expertise to turn to. With many human-constructed systems straining under the pressure of the COVID-19 pandemic, we are reminded now more than ever of our humbling relationship to the natural world. Janine Benyus, founder of the Biomimicry Institute, said it best: when we begin to see nature as a source of inspiration and ideas, instead of a source of goods, our respect for life and its adaptive ability grows. As designers, we are committed to elevating nature to understand that social issues are not disconnected from environmental issues. We commit to hold these life-centered principles as we rebuild a new normal. These are diversity, reciprocity, responsibility, adaptability, emergence, and alignment. In these times of isolation and uncertainty, this is a call to action to look to nature for inspiration. We can continue to find solace in the natural world, refuge in the fresh air, and reconnect to ourselves and each other.
Great. So as I said, this concept of biomimicry is not new, at least in the West. As early as the 1920s, this concept of drawing inspiration from nature was gaining momentum. This Raoul Francais, who was an Austro-Hungarian botanist, in the early and mid 1900s, wrote a book called Plants as Inventors, and really talked about this concept of the biotechnique theory, where he identified sort of 7 functional sort of forms within the natural world that can be found in any system or process or object. And he really is seen as the founding father of bionics and biomimetics in the West. You can see here this picture from his book, where he shows an illustration of a pepper shaker on the right, which was designed and drew inspiration from the poppy seed pods. And so, you know, this idea of finding inspiration in the natural world in a natural form to design human products and objects is nothing new. Could I just ask everyone to please mute your microphones? Thank you. So Francais was writing about this in the 1920s, and we see even in the Bauhaus in Germany in the turn of the century, the mid 1930s to the 1940s, many of the Bauhaus designers and educators were also drawing inspiration from Francais and others in this biomimetic concept. More recently, we see this book from the Biomimicry Institute from Janine Benyes, a real seminal book, really challenging designers and engineers to rethink our processes and ask fundamental questions about the impact of our work on natural ecosystems, but more so even asking us to begin our process by asking the simple question, what would nature do? And Benyes really presented a pretty simple definition for biomimicry. It is learning from and then emulating natural forms, processes, and ecosystems to create more sustainable designs. And I want to address some of the terminology that she uses here, because she was very intentional about certain words that are really important for us to unpack to understand this more deeply. So she talks about the idea of biomimicry as the conscious emulation of life's genius. Now, the first word that's really important to understand is conscious. So it's really about a very intentional process, creating conditions conducive to life, right? We see in a lot of design sometimes designers drawing inspiration from natural forms, where you're mimicking just the physical form found in nature. But unless it's really grounded in a real set of life principles, according to Benyes, and I would agree, it really is not following life's principles. If you're creating, for example, a bag that is using crocodile skin as a way to draw inspiration from nature, you're really contrary to the principles of life. Benyes presents these 6 principles of life: adapting to changing conditions, evolving to survive, integrating development with growth, being locally attuned and responsive, using life-friendly chemistry, and also resource efficiency. You can find a lot more detail about each of these. I'm going to put a link in the chat to the biomimicry.org website. You'll also find there a list of other readings and resources where you can go deeper into these concepts. Benyes also, another word that is really important to define is emulation. So she makes the point that the goal is not to try to recreate the spider, but to recreate and mimic the design principles and living lessons of the spider, right? And so when you think about the terms she uses of life's genius, she asks these 3 questions. So as we begin a design process, we first ask, what would nature do here? So we're looking to nature as a model for how we design our process or solution. And also importantly, what wouldn't nature do here? So we're using nature also as a measure, as a set of criteria to determine whether or not in a natural, life-centered ecosystem, would nature do what we are proposing? And then also asking the question, why not? And that is turning to nature as a mentor, looking to nature not in an extractive way, but looking to the wisdom of nature to guide our work. As we said in the video, there's 4 billion years of research and development in nature that we should look to. Nature has answered and asked most of the questions that we ask ourselves. So she also talked about quieting human cleverness, and that's really about we as humans having more humility and calming our hubris, that we as humans are more intelligent than other species, that we have the answers to everything. But really, as I said, looking to other species as our elders for guidance, wisdom, expertise, and experience. She talks about the 3 levels of biomimicry. So at one level, we're looking to natural forms for inspiration, like the photo I showed you from the Francais book of looking at the form of the poppy seed pod to inspire how to design a pepper shaker. But it's also about looking to natural processes, how nature does certain things, how nature makes certain things. What is the process that nature uses that is more life-centered, aligned? And then also looking at systems, looking at the broader contexts within nature, the interconnectedness of all species within a broader ecosystem and biosphere. And so that also is to encourage designers to look at the implications, not designing their work in isolation, but really looking at issues and problems in a broader, interconnected, systemic way. And so these terms are important. She talks about ethos, the idea of really integrating a sustainability win into our process. That is being very intentional about integrating life principles and using life's principles as the benchmark, as the criteria against which to measure our process and our solutions. And then to the idea of biophilia that we talked about earlier, about how we can inspire ourselves and others to reconnect as humans to the natural world around us and seeing ourselves as a part of an interconnected system. And then the emulate idea of really bringing biology into design, integrating biology into our design process, educating designers around biological principles and processes, and looking to design for advice and inspiration, not just copying its natural form. So if I could ask you again to please mute your microphones. I'm hearing a lot of background noise there. So it's not only important to talk about what biomimicry is, but also what it isn't. So this term is being used a lot around us. You see here an engineered man-made gecko. Clearly this is mimicking the natural form of this amazing species. But is that biomimicry? I would ask you to think a little bit about some of the other terms that are being used out there and how we differentiate among them. So these are just a few of the other bios that are also being used, sometimes synonymously with biomimicry, but I think inaccurately so. So biophilic or biophilia, as we talked about, is really about mimicking the form and the spirit of nature, right? So if a design, I put here the example of like people putting plant walls in their building or making their floors out of cork. This is sort of bringing elements of nature into our space, into our human world, but I think that is fundamentally very different from the philosophy of biomimicry and life-centered design. Biophilia, we talked about, this is more of a philosophy of life. Bioutilization is really about harvesting and acquiring materials from nature. So for example, if we want wooden floors, we have to cut down trees to make the wooden floors. Or we're harvesting plants for medicinal purposes, right? This is bioutilization, basically using materials generated by nature. This idea of bioassisted is really about sort of domesticating organisms to accomplish a function. So we see this a lot in science, where we may have a species that is being used in a laboratory, like bacteria, to treat water purification. Or by another example of bioassisted would be breeding animals, breeding cows, for example, to produce milk, right? So this is sort of using natural species to produce materials for human consumption or human use. Very different from the concept of biomimicry. And then in engineering, we hear a lot of this terminology around biomimetics or bionics. And this we see in bioengineering, a lot of sort of genetic modifications of nature. So so-called human improvements on nature, or using our science and knowledge of nature to sort of synthetically produce others. So these are just a few examples of other terminology. You can see there's a glossary of terms here that the Biomimicry Institute has produced, which I'll put into the chat now, which goes into a lot of other examples of terminology in this biomimetic space. So it's important for us to be clear in how we're using terminology. And I think the guiding philosophy of biomimicry gives a lot of clarity around what is and isn't. So we see a lot of examples, others using principles of biomimicry. One of the more famous examples that is talked about a lot is Velcro. You can see on the right is now used in so many different purposes and products in manufacturing. This was evolved out of an inspiration in Switzerland from these thistles that had these sort of hook-like elements at the end of them that then inspired the form and design of Velcro. Another example in transportation is the Japanese Shinkansen, the speed train, how that drew inspiration from the beak of the kingfisher bird. But I want to also mention that a lot of the examples and case studies that we see about biomimicry and life-centered design typically are more engineering or product-oriented examples. But I want to share here, this is an example where the city of Portland used the concept of biomimicry more broadly. I'll put a link to an article in the chat where they really looked at fungi and mushrooms and the ecosystem around them to inspire how they redesigned what they called their eco districts in Portland, and trying to come up with more sustainable approach to economic development in the city. So I put this here. I just want to make the point that I think while most of the biomimetically inspired designs tend to be celebrated in product design and engineering, what I think is really exciting and interesting now is seeing more and more of these cases around sort of design processes and systems as well. And so wanted to share just a little bit about how we are approaching that also in the Center for Social Design here at MICA. For the last 4 or 5 years, we have taught this class, Biomimicry for Social Innovation, in our center. This is just an example from last year. We start our year, you can see us here in this picture at our National Aquarium. with a sloth up in the corner there, really getting students out into experience and appreciate the natural world and natural species. We've used this Biomimicry Global Design Challenge. I'm putting the link in the chat. Unfortunately, this is the challenge has just closed its final year, I understand, but this is a global design challenge organized by the Biomimicry Institute. We designed a class to coincide with this process. So students not only learned about the principles of biomimicry, but also then applied it to a specific problem, and their ideas and process were then submitted to this competition. It's been a great professional opportunity for the students as well. If you go to that website, you'll see submissions from previous years, including 3 years of our students submitting to this challenge, and they were also winners in all 3 years. But the biomimicry design process is what we use for the class, but also to introduce to students so that they begin to question and challenge their human-centered design approach and integrate more of the biological principles in their process. So here you see the 6 steps that the biomimicry design process integrates of define, which is about what do you want your design to do, biologize, which is where in nature has this been done before, how do we look to find how nature has solved similar analogous problems. Discover, this is where we look for inspiration of how nature, specific examples of how nature has solved this problem. Abstract is when we look at those different inspirations from nature and begin to translate those biological strategies for application in the human world. And emulate is where we begin to basically prototype those ideas and develop design concepts that are based on those inspirations from nature. And then evaluate, the final step is about how does our design concept measure up against life's principles? So it's always, the evaluate step is really integral and critical for us to constantly remind ourselves that we have to be designing in a way that is consistent with the life principles that I proposed to you earlier. So last year, our students, this is in the midst of the COVID crisis, the students were really looking at sort of issues of food insecurity in Baltimore. And I want to share a brief video with you about the concept that emerged when they applied a biomimicry process to their work.
The COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in major disruptions in our food system, exacerbating issues of food access around the world. In Baltimore, emergency responders worked overtime to coordinate assistance for food insecure communities. At the same time, grassroots efforts joined in an attempt to bridge the widening gap between food availability and food recovery. Still, challenges to align these efforts made it apparent there is a systemic issue of resource distribution and communication. In close partnership with the Baltimore Office of Sustainability, we wanted to understand how a resilient food system would recover from these disruptions. Understanding this context led to the development of our design challenge. How might we cultivate a more connected and responsive food system network to ensure food access during times of crisis? We first asked, how does nature distribute resources, especially in response to situations of isolation and disturbance? Looking to nature's unifying patterns, it was evident that reciprocity was the common thread of the biological strategies we discovered. Found in our own backyard of the Chesapeake Forest, we were especially inspired by the local symbiotic relationship between trees and mycelium networks. This mycorrhizal relationship embodies reciprocity, connectivity, and adaptability, as it facilitates communication and nutrient flow among trees, while the trees in turn provide sugar to mycelium. This exchange makes it possible for hemp trees to nourish young saplings and demonstrates a unique way of staying connected despite social isolation. We translated this natural inspiration to design a symbiotic and interconnected food distribution infrastructure, like that between the trees and mycorrhizal network. My Oak Public Market is an online platform designed to increase food access to vulnerable populations by diversifying the distribution of resources to community hubs and individuals. Vendors are provided a low-risk platform to an expanded customer base. Reciprocally, customers can access this variety of products regardless of physical proximity, income, or telecommunication capability. By cultivating these new connections and aggregating valuable user data, My Oak Public Market simultaneously strengthens the resiliency of the Baltimore food system to face any crisis. In response to these times of crisis, My Oak Public Market ensures resources are shared where they are needed most. As designers working for the advancement of social justice and equity, we are committed to ensure food security for all. Through a symbiotic, community-centered approach, every resident in Baltimore would have equitable access to food with dignity, regardless of their socioeconomic status.
So I shared that example with you just to emphasize that point that, biomimicry and life-centered design can be applied not only to redesigning products or engineering solutions, but also looking at sort of systems, right? And so this is a good example of a system that was broken in Baltimore for a lot of people during the COVID crisis, getting access to affordable and healthy food. And the concept of My Oak was to really look at it from that systems perspective and apply that inspiration that they mentioned in the video from a natural system in the Chesapeake forests and the mycelium network for inspiration on how to reimagine and redesign that system. I'll put into the chat that video gave a little bit of insight into this concept, but for those who are interested to look more, I put some more links into the My Oak Market and their Instagram page also that shows a little bit more about their work and the concept and the research behind it. So I'd like in our remaining time together to begin to just play a little bit with some of the concepts that I introduced. We obviously don't have time to go into all phases of the biomimicry design process, but what I'd like to do is spend a little time on the second phase of this process, the Biologize, since this is really one that for those of us who are very familiar with the human-centered design process, the Biologize phase is a sort of new way of thinking and a new process that we need to bring into our more human-focused design process. So in the Biologize process, we talk a lot about understanding function. Function is a really common term and concept in biology, but we as designers don't oftentimes learn about this in our design education. And function, by definition, is the purpose of something, right? So in design, function refers to something that you need your design solution to do. So, and in biomimicry, function refers to the role played by an organism's adaptations or behaviors that enable it to survive, right? So organisms meet functional needs through biological strategies. A biological strategy is sort of a process that performs a function for an organism. It's an adaptation the organism has in order to survive. So that's a lot of words. Let me explain what I mean by that. So if you think about this beautiful polar bear, one purpose of the polar bear's fur is to keep the bear warm, right? So to apply this terminology, the function of the bear's fur is to insulate or to conserve heat. That is its purpose. The fur's purpose is to provide that insulation in order to conserve heat that then in turn keeps the bear warmer. So the polar bear's fur is a strategy that it uses for insulation, right? So when we are thinking about function in our design process, we're asking the question, what function do you want to solve for, right? So we're looking at the problem that we have been given as designers and asking ourselves, what do I want my design solution to do? What do I want what I am creating to solve for? So functions, we find it really useful to articulate functions as a question plus a verb. So for example, how does nature ... And so for example, you wouldn't ask nature how to make a fan, right? Like, it's really hot here today. If I'm trying to solve for the design to solve that problem, I wouldn't go and ask nature, hey, nature, how do you create a fan for my apartment? Instead, I would ask, how does nature move air? How does nature circulate air? How does nature move cool air through spaces? How does nature cool, right? So you're looking behind the design challenge to articulate a functional question. I'll put a link into the chat where you can explore this a lot further. The Biomimicry Institute and Global Design Challenge has a lot of great tools. They have a toolbox, a biomimicry toolbox that you can look to, and there's a whole section in there about function and strategy. And so what I'd like to do is have you practice that a little bit. So I'm going to put into the chat a worksheet. Now, I don't want you to overthink this or be intimidated by it. The worksheet I'm putting into the chat is a PDF. And it basically is asking a series of functional questions. And what I'd like you to do is just to take 5 minutes to look at the questions on this worksheet and try, in the blank below each of them, try to imagine how would you articulate that as a functional question? So again, using this formula of how does nature ... So looking at these questions. So for example, this one is, I love the idea of an open office plan, but it's so noisy. How can I keep my employees happy and productive? What is the functional question behind that? How would you articulate that if you're beginning your design process to address this problem of the noisiness of an open office plan? What would be the functional question that you would see behind that? So I'd just like you to practice a little bit with this worksheet to try to identify and articulate a functional question. So we're going to just take 4 to 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and I'll share with you the answer sheet for this as well. So if you're able to download the PDF that I put into the chat, I just invite you to look at that. Don't worry about it. There's no perfect answer for each one. There are multiple answers for each question. It's just to get you to practice the idea of scoping out a functional question. So just take a couple of minutes to look at that. just take one more minute. Great. How did you do? I would say the first time that I did that, or our students did that, it was not easy. I'm putting into the chat now the answer key, see if you can all. I think it's going to be hard to see this, but I'll try to make this a little bit bigger. So we won't go through all of them, but just a couple just to sort of talk through the answers. So the one that I mentioned before, I love the idea of an open office plan, but it's so noisy. How can I keep my employees happy and productive? So if you're presented with that design problem, what is the functional issue behind that? Really, it is, we would want to ask nature, how does nature manage sound or manage vibrations, for example? The one below that, giant kelp resist mechanical failure by allowing optimal flow past their fronds. So we would be asking nature, how does nature manage the flow of fluids, right? So you're really looking behind each of these design challenges to try to understand what is the functional issue behind that. The first one, food packaging contains multiple layers to meet multiple functions, including preserving the freshness of food. So we might ask nature, how does nature manage oxygen across a barrier, right? So I put the answer sheet in there. As I mentioned, each of these functional design challenges has multiple, each of these design problems or challenges has multiple functions. There are different ways for you to articulate the functional question behind it. So there's really not any one answer, but this exercise is really an important one for designers to begin to understand the concepts of function and how to articulate functional questions in their design process. And then that takes us to the next phase that I wanted to talk a little bit more about, of the discover phase. So this is here after you've done what we just did of biologizing your design challenge and articulating a functional question. You then are asking, you're looking to nature as to get wisdom and to get inspiration, right? So in the discover phase, we're looking to natural models, organisms and ecosystems that might have addressed that same problem, that same functional question that we're asking. So once you've articulated that functional question, we want to then look to generate as many possible sources of inspiration as we can using our how does nature question, right? So I want to share with you a really great resource for this. So if you get to this point in your design process where you have articulated a design problem and a functional question, like where can you begin to look for nature's inspiration? Obviously, we can do that in many, many ways, beginning with just going outside and exploring nature around us. But this website, which I just put the link for you into the chat, is, oh, somebody is having problems hearing me. Can others hear me okay? Manish, can you can, okay, yes.
Yes,
Okay.
we can hear.
Okay, thank you. So I'm sorry, AN Singh, I'm not sure what's happening. You're able to hear me? Okay, great. So this Ask Nature link that I put into the chat is a really great resource for designers that are looking for nature, looking to nature for inspiration. Basically, the way that Ask Nature works is it's a database created by the Biomimicry Institute together with biologists and other scientists around the world. And it's organized around the different functional areas. So basically, you can literally type into and search Ask Nature the questions that you articulate, the functional questions that you articulate. And so what I'd like to have you do now is to just try that out, is just to practice that. And so I'm going to give you a design challenge. This is a design challenge that we were working on last year. In Baltimore City, one really big problem around food waste is food waste from restaurants, right? There are tons of food scraps as well as other materials that are discarded and wasted from restaurants in the city. And so the design challenge that we were asked by the Baltimore Office of Sustainability is how to address that. How might we engage restaurants in building a culture of wasted food prevention, right? And so let me just break that down a little bit. How might we engage restaurants? And in this case, we were looking at all types of restaurants, from fast food and fine dining. We were also looking to hospitality professionals, caterers, wedding planners, event planners, as well as service workers in restaurants to get their perspective around wasted food and prevention. Hold on just a sec, my mouse, there we go. Then wasted food included food scraps, spoiled food, grease and oil from restaurant kitchens, etc. And we were really especially asked to think about prevention. So we were not looking, for example, of how to recycle food waste or reuse wasted materials, but rather looking at creating within restaurants a culture of prevention. So we want to preempt the problem of food waste, not deal only with the outcomes. So what I'd like to have you do is to think about this question. If you were presented with this question as a designer, how would you first articulate a functional question, as we just practiced? What are, obviously there are many, many different functional questions beyond this. And so I'd like to encourage you to think about first, what aspect of this design challenge would you like to focus on? And then articulate a functional question. And then I'd like you to practice asking nature, using the Ask Nature website that I put into the chat, to look for some natural inspiration to address that functional question. I'm putting into the chat this worksheet. You don't have to use it. It's just a suggestion to help you first articulate a functional question. What do you want your design to do? Or how does nature ... Then looking to ask nature, what are some, and I'll put the link to Ask Nature again into the chat for you. You then would look to Ask Nature to find some natural inspiration for that functional problem. And then if you find some ideas or images that you'd like to collect. So I'd like to just give you 5 minutes to play with this a little bit. First, articulating the functional question. Here's your design challenge. What functional question would you like to focus on? And then take 5 minutes to look at the Ask Nature website and see what inspiration you might find that could address one aspect of building a culture of wasted food prevention in restaurants. So think about food waste there in your home city in Varanasi or wherever you might be, and just play with that a little bit. So I'll give you 5 minutes. Okay. How did that go? Is there anyone that would like to share either a functional question that you articulated related to this design challenge, or a natural inspiration that you found on Ask Nature? Was there anything you found that you were really excited about of a natural inspiration for how to address this issue of food waste in restaurants? How did you find using the Ask Nature site? Was that a helpful resource? Don't be shy. Okay, well, I won't put anybody on the spot. But I hope that Ask Nature is pretty easy to use. And I think, like, even if you just type in 1 or 2 words related to your problem, we found it as a really great starting point. Then it helps us to identify some different types of organisms or species that might lend themselves to solving for that functional design problem. And then, of course, we oftentimes then will do our own additional research around that specific natural system or process. And we've also, in our biomimicry course, had a biologist be a part of our team, so that as we get to the place where we need to ask nature for inspiration, it's really helpful to have a biologist around the table who can point us to different places that we might look in biological systems for inspiration. So we are over time, and I thank you we're about 15 minutes over time, but I really appreciated all of you joining me this evening. I know it's later there. I'm gonna put into the chat a link to our website, micasocialdesign.com, where you can find more about our center and some of the cases and examples of our work. And thank you so much. We're so honored to be a part of this collaboration with all of you there. And I wish you the best in furthering. I know you've been looking at a lot of different issues of sustainability in this module. And I hope that this concept of life-centered design and biomimicry inspires you to think of ways that you can connect to nature in your work as a designer. So thank you so much. Manish, I'll turn it over to you. I don't know if you have any closing comments that you'd like to say.
Thank you. Thank you, Lee. The forum is open for the questions. If someone have any questions, then 1 or 2 questions we will entertain it. Please all other mute their mic. If anyone have any questions, please ask, put in the chat box.
I see.
But in between that, Lee, that's a very, your class is really very great for that. And very good examples, and relevance of this, your topic is really amazing. Thanks for this wonderful presentation and inspiration. Yeah, someone is, how we can explain the nature is an important thing. Someone is asking the questions. If you see in the chat box, please explain 1 or 2 if you have time.
So, absolutely. So how can we explain nature is an important thing? That's a great question. We found with our students, this is an important question of how to inspire them to look to nature. And I think some of our students were already interested and inclined to this topic. But then there were a lot of others who thought that this concept of life-centered design or biomimicry was only for people who were interested in environmental issues or working on environmental problems. And this was a challenge for us on how to demonstrate to our colleagues and students that the concepts of life-centered design are really important for all problems, not only just for environmental issues and problems. And so I think what we found is what we're trying to do now. I was working with one of our graduate students last year on her thesis, which was looking at how do we more intentionally integrate life-centered design principles into our human-centered design process. So it's not seen as a separate process, but it's seen as a part of the same process. So even as we're approaching a design problem from this human-centered design lens, how do we integrate some of the principles that I shared with you earlier about life-centered design into that process? And also showing more cases, like what I mentioned to you before. A big problem was that most of the case studies that we could find about biomimicry were about products or engineering problems, right? And so I think we're starting to see more examples and cases that are applied to social systems and social processes. I think the more of those examples that we can point to help to show designers that are not inclined to issues of climate crisis or environment, how life-centered design principles can be valuable in advancing their work in the human-centered design. So I think it's really about demonstrating and integrating, I think, into the existing processes and education rather than creating it as a separate thing altogether. So here I see this is a great question. We see genetically modified animals and plants which result in betterment, but sometimes animals are hurt in the experiment. Is it good to interfere with nature? Well, great question. I want to go back to this slide that I shared with you about some of the different terminology, these different bios. And I think what you're getting at with your question is really this issue of bioutilization or bioengineering. I mean, there's a lot of literature out there around the ethical dimensions of bioengineering and bioutilization or bioassistance as well. I think this is a challenge. We need to get really clear on terminology so that we as designers, as we're talking about life-centered design and biomimicry, we're really grounding it in the clarity of the philosophy around it, so that we're not creating confusion about what is or isn't biomimicry. And our philosophy within the Center for Social Design is really grounded on that of the Biomimicry Institute and the life principles that I introduced here. If the design solutions are not philosophically and practically aligned with these life principles, then I think we would argue it's not biomimetic design, it's not life-centered design. And so to your question, I think our role of designers is to also have a real clarity around a guiding philosophy to our work. What do you think about reducing industrial activities and moving towards self-sufficient communities, producing things they require to help nature prosper? Great question. I'm putting this slide back up because I think what your question gets to is this issue of intentionality and conscious emulation, that we have to not only look for inspiration from nature for natural forms, but also fundamentally looking at nature as measure, as I mentioned here. As I mentioned here on this, on this slide, that we're also looking to nature not only for inspiration, but also nature as measure, right? So we need to set a set of criteria where we really are asking, what would nature not do? And how do we measure the impacts and implications of our design decisions on nature so that we're not designing products, processes, or systems that have a negative impact on the natural world, and widening our perspective beyond looking at it only from a human perspective. So let's see, maybe one other. I think the very first question, how honeybees inspire us for design. So I'll just put this back up on the screen and put this link into the chat again. I think the honeybees are a great metaphorical inspiration, as Jesse Weaver's article talks about, of honeybees as a sentinel species, as a very vulnerable species, using that as a metaphor to challenge ourselves to design for the most vulnerable, not only in human sense of the most vulnerable people, but also designs that really address the needs of the most vulnerable endangered species or vulnerable species or ecosystems in the natural world. And then if you look at Ask Nature, I think you'll find some really great examples specifically about honeybees as an inspiration, because honeybees also are an example of some of the social insects. Our students did a lot of research this past year at the Museum of Natural History. There's an insect museum and an insect research lab there, where there's a lot of interesting work being done around social insects like ants, bees, and others that we can learn from, how they organize themselves, how they build systems of reciprocity, of communication, of support, and what we as humans can learn from from social species in the natural world. So I think honeybees are a really great species to research more, especially for social design, because we can learn a lot more about natural social systems. So, and with that, I think we'll wrap up. I want to thank you again. I'm putting my contact information up on the screen. Thank you again so much. My email is there. I put our website link in the chat. Would love to hear from all of you, and Manish obviously knows how to find us. We get so much inspiration from collaborating with all of you, and I'm really grateful to have that connection. So I wish you a beautiful evening there, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Lee. Special thanks to you for today's lecture. Thank you and take care. And you also enjoy your sunny day. In India, it's a rainy season.
Yes, and here it's so hot. So
that's great.
So have a lovely day. See you all soon. And Manish, I'll send you the recording from the session later today.
Thank you for that. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.